In part two of the chapter 16 lecture video, I wanted to go over section 2, which deals with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And we're going to talk about the structure a little bit, and then we'll talk about examples of some of the hormones that each of these produces. And so we'll also mention a few things in lab about each one of these. So first of all, we'll start with the hypothalamus. And in the picture, you can see kind of where the hypothalamus is located. If you remember doing the brain dissection in 168, you probably talked about the thalamus region, which is kind of a circular region, which is kind of seen right here in the picture. And just underneath that is what's called the hypothalamus, and it's directly connected to your pituitary gland. There's a stalk here, a piece of tissue called the infundibulum that connects the hypothalamus with the pituitary gland. A couple of vocabulary words for you. The pituitary gland basically is sectioned into two portions, the anterior side and the posterior side of the pituitary gland. And you can see some terminology up here. First of all, another name for the pituitary gland is hypophysis. And if you're talking about the anterior side, it's referred to as the adenohypophysis. And the posterior side is called the neurohypophysis. And we'll talk more about these words, especially in lab when we look at some of the tissue for each one. Now, the anterior pituitary gland produces and secretes 9 main hormones. We're going to look at 6 of these. Your textbook looks at 6 of these hormones, so that's what we'll look at. The posterior side secretes neurohormones, and we'll look at 2 examples of that. And then the hypothalamus secretes a variety of hormones that basically help to regulate the hormones from the anterior side and the posterior side of the pituitary. So, for example, let me show you how these two are connected and how they communicate with each other. In this diagram, it shows, again, a side view of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, because it's part of the brain, is nerve tissue, and so it's made out of neurons. And so in the diagram, you see some neurons up here. They secrete, in this case, some hormones here. These would be neurohormones. And you have something called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. This is like a small miniaturized circulatory system that connects the hypothalamus with the anterior side of the pituitary gland. And so what happens is the neurohormones that reside in the brain, the neurons that reside in the brain secrete neurohormones into this portal system, into these vessels, and those hormones travel down into the pituitary gland, where they cause the pituitary gland to release other hormones. The posterior side is a little different because the posterior side is directly connected to the hypothalamus. It shares some of the same neurons, and the nervous tissue is the same in the posterior side as is the hypothalamus. And so here you have a little different scenario. Instead of having a portal system, you actually have a nerve tract. And so here you see some neurons that still reside in the hypothalamus. They send action potentials down through the axons. This is a nerve tract called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. It sends action potentials down, and that causes a release of hormones, neurohormones, into the posterior side of the pituitary gland, and that releases hormones into the bloodstream. And we'll talk about 2 of those. So the first of the 2 that we'll mention is something called ADH. This is antidiuretic hormone. It's produced or secreted from the posterior side of the pituitary gland. It's also referred to sometimes as vasopressin because it does have an effect on your vascular system. It actually causes constriction of some of your blood vessels. And so there's one main thing that antidiuretic hormone does, and that decreases urine production. By doing that, it helps you to retain more fluids. And so early on, I want you to get to know and understand ADH quite a bit, because you're going to see this hormone in several other systems, because it does deal with fluid balance. Any other systems that have an effect with fluid balance is going to will have an effect with ADH. So, for example, your cardiovascular system is based on how much fluid you have in the bloodstream. Well, that is partially determined by this hormone called ADH. And your urinary system depends on how much fluid you have. That's going in the urinary system and is being excreted as waste, and that depends on, again, this hormone ADH. So ADH is antidiuretic. It helps to promote fluid balance and actually water retention. And it's regulated by changes in what's called blood osmolality. This is basically just a concentration of how concentrated your blood is. And so if the blood is more concentrated, if it has more dissolved ions and solutes in the blood, it's more concentrated, then you need this ADH to help retain some more fluid. And that impacts how much blood volume you have. Also make the note that blood volume and blood pressure is correlated, has a correlation, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the cardiovascular system. The ADH is regulated by two types of sensory receptors. The first type is called an osmoreceptor, and the second kind is a baroreceptor. Each one is trying to monitor something to help balance your fluid levels. The first one, the osmoreceptor, is what's inside of the hypothalamus that's trying to determine your concentration of your body fluids, especially your blood concentration. And so the scenarios up here kind of show what happens. So for example, if your electrolyte concentration goes up, then you need more ADH. All right, the brackets here represent concentration. And so what this is saying is an increase in the concentration of electrolytes. Electrolytes are the ions or the solutes that you have dissolved in your body fluids. If that goes up, then you need more fluid to balance it out. So one way that your body can get more fluid, or at least retain fluid, is through ADH. Another way to think about it, this actually says the same thing, but another way to think about it is look in terms of water. Rather than looking at the electrolytes, look in terms of water. If your water level is low, if you're dehydrated, for example, you have low water concentration, you're dehydrated, then you need to retain more fluid. If you're dehydrated, you don't want to lose more fluid. You want to retain the fluid that you already have. And so you need more ADH. ADH is antidiuretic, so it helps you to hold on to retain more of that fluid. The second type of receptor is called a baroreceptor. The baro prefix up here refers to pressure. And so you have specialized neurons inside of the heart, mainly in the right atrium and some of the major vessels like the aorta. And that can detect changes in your blood pressure. And so here is a scenario where if blood pressure starts to go down, then perhaps it's because you have low blood volume, low body fluids. Maybe, again, you're dehydrated. And so you need more body fluids. You need more fluid retention. And so that means that your pituitary gland should secrete more ADH to help retain more body fluids. The second main hormone from the posterior pituitary gland is what's called oxytocin. Oxytocin is also a neurohormone, and it gets secreted. When it gets secreted, it mainly helps in uterine contractions, and so this mainly is involved in the female reproductive system. You see here a picture of a uterus here, and so this gets secreted. It's secreted when a reflex action takes place. So during childbirth, the baby that's being born pushes on the uterus here. This is a smooth muscle, and that sends information up to the hypothalamus. So stretch of the uterus sends information up to the hypothalamus, and that sends a signal to secrete oxytocin. Oxytocin increases more uterine contraction. So this basically is a positive feedback loop, just like you talked about in chapter 1, negative and positive feedback loops. This will be a positive feedback loop because you get further away from homeostasis. Oxytocin further stretches the uterine wall, the uterine muscle wall, and that causes the feedback loop to continue. The other thing that this does is it helps in the milk release from the mammary glands for breastfeeding. Those are the two hormones, oxytocin and ADH, two main hormones from the posterior pituitary gland. Now let's take a look at the anterior pituitary gland. We're going to look at 6 main hormones coming from that side. And so here we see two definitions for you, tropic hormones and trophic hormones. You have to kind of be careful with the terms here. They're very similar in spelling, but they do have different meanings. Tropic hormones, basically, they stimulate secretion of other hormones from other cells. In other words, you have kind of a chain reaction type hormone system. One hormone stimulates a gland to release a different hormone. And so that's a tropic hormone. It's a chain reaction type scenario. A trophic hormone has to do with growth. It stimulates some type of growth from the target tissues. Now, all the ones listed here fall into the category of tropic hormones. They all cause the release of additional hormones, and we'll look at some of those pathways as we go through these. So these 6, we'll kind of go through each one separately, beginning with the thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating TSH comes from the thyroid gland, but there's a little pathway involved here that begins with the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus in the brain produces and secretes thyroid releasing hormone, TRH, and that goes into the that goes through the portal system down into the anterior pituitary gland, where it causes a release of TSH. TSH causes the secretion and secretion of thyroid hormones, T3 and T4, and they get stored inside of these follicles. And we'll talk more about this actually in lab. But T3 and T4 are basically metabolic hormones. Number 2 is something called ACTH. This is adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is also regulated by the hypothalamus, but it is produced. This is being produced by the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland. There is a hormone called hypothalamic corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. This is what is regulating the production of ACTH. ACTH is released from the anterior pituitary gland. It goes into your bloodstream, goes into circulation, where it has its target tissue, which would be the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland then secretes something called cortisol, and cortisol helps to do a few things. It helps to regulate or control your inflammatory response, your immune system. It also helps to break down fats and proteins so that you can get energy from some of these. It also helps to increase your blood glucose levels, again, so that you can have the energy that you need for metabolism. There's some indication that ACTH production increases in response to stress. So sometimes you see the cortisol hormone referred to as a stress hormone, because when you're under stress conditions, especially long-term stress, the ACTH from the pituitary gland increases, and that causes an increase in cortisol. Number 3 is prolactin. This is the third hormone from the anterior pituitary gland. It is also regulated by hormones in the hypothalamus, PRH, that's prolactin releasing hormone, and PIH, that's prolactin inhibiting hormone. And it basically plays a role in the milk production for females. 4 and 5 are going to be both reproductive hormones. We'll mention these briefly here, but we'll see these a little more details once we get to the last chapter that we'll cover, which will include the reproductive system. But LH is luteinizing hormone. It is a growth type hormone, and it does affect your reproductive cells in both male and females. And so in males, it stimulates the production of testosterone, one of the main reproductive hormones for males. And it is being controlled or regulated through something called GnRH, that's gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is produced in the hypothalamus. For females, it stimulates the production of estrogen and progesterone from the ovaries eventually, and we'll talk more about this when we get to chapter 26, but eventually LH, once it surges, once you have an LH surge, that triggers the release of the egg cell, and that's a process called ovulation. FSH, number 5, this is follicle stimulating hormone. Again, this is a gonadotropin, so it is a growth type hormone found in the reproductive systems of both males and females. And in males, it has something to do with testosterone. Again, it helps the testosterone hormone become more concentrated, and it is also being controlled using the same hormone GnRH from the hypothalamus. For females, it plays a main role here because it helps to mature the what are called follicles. Follicles are basically a special cell type that houses and protects and helps develop the developing egg cells, the oocytes or the egg cells. They reside inside of a housing of cells called follicle cells or follicular cells, and this FSH causes them to become active and start growing. And when it does that, they produce estrogen. And number 6 is growth hormone, or GH. Sometimes you see this referred to as somatotropin. Most of the time it's just referred to as growth hormone. It has different effects on the body, and so your book kind of talks about short-term effects versus long-term effects. So the short-term effects of growth hormone is basically all based on energy. You need extra energy to go through metabolism and growth of tissues, whether it's connective tissue or muscle tissue. And so all of these things are based on getting energy, promotion of fat breakdown, so you digest fats a little faster, and that releases energy. Generation of glucose in the liver. And so that can take place. That's a process called gluconeogenesis, and that can take place again to help you have enough energy for metabolism. And it also slows down a little bit of the glucose uptake by muscle fibers, and that just allows more glucose to be used to actually build up muscle tissue rather than being used for contraction of the muscle cells. And basically all of this is trying to increase the amount of glucose and lipids, and that does this so that your body cells can use it for the fuel that it needs to go through growth. The long-term effects, these are a little different in that they're not directly controlled through the growth hormone, but in a sense they have a connection to growth hormone. But what happens is there's like an intermediate chemical, kind of a go-between type chemical, because growth hormone gets released and it goes to target tissues such as the liver, and that produces another hormone called insulin-like growth factor, or IGF. And so this insulin-like growth factor is kind of what it sounds like. It is similar to insulin in that it lowers your blood glucose levels, and we'll talk more about insulin when we get to the pancreas. But one of the things that insulin does is allows your blood glucose levels to go down. That means as cells, your normal body cells start to absorb the glucose easier once you have the insulin there. And that means that your cells can take up the glucose and they can use it to produce the ATP energy that they need. And so this IGF, insulin-like growth factor, is needed by all of your cells. Again, it kind of helps in metabolism. It triggers protein synthesis, cell division, and so you have cells that are dividing and getting stronger and growing, and it helps in muscle development.